Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, a podcast about early American history with Liz Covart. The study of history is key to understanding who we are and how we can affect a better future. Ben Franklin's World will introduce you to historical people and events that have impacted and shaped our present-day world. And now, here's your host, Liz Covart.
Hello, and welcome to episode 99 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. Lately, pirates have reclaimed a presence in our popular culture. Thanks to movies like Pirates of the Caribbean and television shows like Black Sails, we see pirates as peg-legged, eye-patch-wearing, rum-drinking men. But are these representations accurate? What do we really know about pirates? Mark Hanna, an associate professor of history at the University of California, San Diego, and author of the award-winning book Pirate Nests and the Rise of the British Empire, is going to help us fill in the gaps in our knowledge and better understand who pirates were and why they lived the pirate's life. During our conversation, Mark reveals myths and facts about pirates, why colonial communities supported pirates and how pirates supported colonial communities, and the War on Pirates, which took place between 1716 and 1726. But first, can you believe we're on episode 99? Holy cow! To celebrate the show and commemorate episode 100, next week's episode will be a bit different. As per your request, the episode will feature me as guest historian answering your questions. And you had a lot of questions, which, as a tireless poser of questions myself, I certainly appreciated. So be sure to tune in next week for our special 100th episode. Now would be an awesome time to subscribe to the show, by the way, if you haven't already, because subscribing will ensure that you don't miss our special 100th episode or any other episode going forward. You can subscribe to Ben Franklin's World in all your favorite podcast apps, like Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Google Play Music, or Stitcher Radio. Or you can download the free and ever-handy Ben Franklin's World app from your favorite app store. Are you ready for some myth-busting and swashbuckling tales about pirates? Let's go meet our guest historian.
With tidings and wisdom to share about our early American past, here is this week's special guest.
Joining us is an associate professor of history at the University of California, San Diego. He is the winner of the UC San Diego Academic Senate Distinguished Teaching Award, and today he joins us to discuss his book, Pirate Nests and the Rise of the British Empire, 1570 to 1740, winner of the 2016 Frederick Jackson Turner Award. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Mark Hanna.
Thank you, Liz, for having me.
I think we need to begin this conversation by swapping pirate stories. You may not know this, but when I was a little kid, I spent an entire year aspiring to be a pirate. And in some ways, I think I fulfilled that dream because I became a historian, and now I spend my days hunting for information that happens to be buried within documents and objects held by libraries and archives. So that's my pirate story, Mark. What's yours? How did you come to study pirates?
Well, you're not the only one. In my life, I've come across many people who have said similar stories of the desire to be pirates when they were kids, and I sadly have the opposite, which is that I never wanted to be a pirate as a kid. I didn't really read pirate stories. I never dressed as a pirate. In fact, I went to graduate school to study fatherhood in early America, and so I actually studied oral exam fields in religion and family, history, immigration, and I took my exams in those fields, and I wrote what I thought was going to be a first chapter of the dissertation, and it was about a man named William Harris, who was one of the founders of Rhode Island, and he was a great father figure. He saw himself as an Abrahamic sort of man in the New World who's going to build a great sort of New World empire based on his family. He wrote a will that went into 7 generations. And he did this through these sort of really aggressive lawsuits. And when he was in his 60s, he decided he needed to pursue this one lawsuit in London. So he sailed off to London, and on his way there, he was captured by Algerian pirates, where he was enslaved on the walled city of Algiers for, I think, 2 years. And eventually he was redeemed and made his way to London and died within a few weeks of arriving back in London. So I presented this to a group of people, my advisors, as well as a bunch of other graduate students. And I thought I had a good story, and this is going to be a part of the dissertation. And at the end of the sort of discussion, a number of people said, it's interesting. The pirates are the best part of this chapter. I read about, Charleston, South Carolina, and these pirates show up in the 1680s, and no one seems to think it's that big of a deal. And it's really interesting. I put it in a footnote, but I couldn't really think of any reason to sort of discuss it any further. And someone else said, I read about Rhode Island, and pirates show up in the 1690s, and one of them bought land, I think, and no one seemed to think it was that big of a deal. And I was really upset because I was in my 3rd year in graduate school, and I was sort of ready to be on my way to writing about one particular topic, and I knew nothing about pirates. But everyone said, no one's really written about this. It seems pretty important. And so after a lot of grumbling, I said, okay, I'm going to give a month where I'll go into the archives and I'm going to see everything I can. I'm going to read governor's records. I'm going to read trial records, administrative documents. And if I see this as a significant, then maybe I'll go down this road. And there were pirates everywhere. And I was pretty shocked. So I thought this is pretty amazing that no one's really written about these people. But they weren't the kind of pirates we thought they were. They were actually not necessarily the sort of swashbuckling, sort of exciting, dressed up the way we imagined. They were actually not anarchistic or antisocial maniacs. They were actually people who were pretty much welcomed in local communities. And a lot of them bought land. They married local women. One of them married the governor of Pennsylvania's daughter. And so I thought I had something interesting here where all of a sudden the way we imagined piracy seemed quite different than we had imagined it before.
It sounds like your classmates gave you great advice and that you were able to crowdsource your project before crowdsourcing was really a thing.
Yeah, there's a little peer pressure. It's an interesting form of peer pressure because this is before the Pirates of the Caribbean movies came out. So there wasn't really some sort of popular craze at this time. It was actually a pretty unserious topic. I don't think people thought that this was something that was worthy of historical scholarship. And so that became really a real sort of call to arms for me to say, this is, not only pirates are important, they answer everything. They sort of explain politics, law, popular culture. They explain, the rise of the British Empire as a whole. And so it became a real calling card because it was considered, frivolous scholarship to an extent. And so I wanted to see how incredibly significant and important this really was. Then the Pirates of the Caribbean movies came out, and all of a sudden, I sort of rode that wave as far as being a lecturer and a teacher.
You may have rode the popular wave of pirates, but as you noted, the pirates you discovered in your research and wrote about in Pirate Nests seem to be very different from the pirates we would see in that popular Pirates of the Caribbean movie. Would you help us form a better picture of actual pirates? How did the people who lived between the late 16th and early to mid 18th centuries define pirates and piracy?
It's a very wide spectrum. It's heavily debated, although if you actually go to read 17th century lawyers, it's less heavily debated because they had their own sort of understanding of the actual international law. But in reality, on the ground, which is how law actually functions, it was a much wider spectrum of acceptable behavior. The definition, at least today, Oxford English Dictionary, is the action of committing robbery, kidnap, or violence at sea or from the sea without lawful authority, especially from one vessel against another, or an instance of this. And when I teach my classes on piracy, I put this definition on the board, and I try to tear apart almost every word of it, just to basically tell you how complicated this is. I'll just give you one example. The phrase lawful authority. What defines lawful authority? Is it the king? Well, that's probably true. That's the most, central lawful authority. But what about the governor of a local colony? And let's say a governor who's actually voted on by local gentry in Rhode Island, or the governor who is beholden to the council in Jamaica who actually supported Henry Morgan and sent him off to fight the Spanish against the king's wishes. Or what if you are English but choose to fight for the Duke of Savoy and have a commission fighting for a foreign prince? What if you pick up a commission from the Danish governor of St. Thomas that you bought for 500 pounds that essentially said you could attack anybody you want? What if you are a Protestant who's very militant and believes the Protestant Reformation hasn't been fulfilled and therefore attacking Catholic shipping is part of the grand scheme of the Protestant Reformation? Is that the justification? Is that lawful authority? What if you are just Christian, Protestant, or Catholic and you believe that quote-unquote infidels are always to be attacked at all possible times? Well, that means you feel justified in going to the Indian Ocean and attacking ships belonging to the great Mughal emperor. So there's a massive spectrum of wiggle room, and colonial gentry and governors understood this wiggle room, and they took advantage of it. And I should also make it clear, and I'll probably repeat myself a number of times in this point, I think one of the key themes of the book is not highlighting corruption, which I think a lot of people will actually think that is the case because I'm showing people who clearly committed acts of violence and clearly did pretty terrible things from our standards and were actively supported by pretty important people in the colonies. But that does not mean that they themselves, meaning the colonial gentry or governors, thought that those things were necessarily wrong. And so they're not necessarily corrupt if they genuinely, and I think often they did genuinely believe that they were justified in supporting these people, which is why the word pirate is sometimes problematic in describing it because it's such a loaded and a meaningful term in that sense.
It seems like people during the 16th through 18th centuries had a lot of different ideas about who was a pirate and what constituted piracy. Were ideas about who might choose a pirate's life also as murky and varied? Would you tell us more about what sorts of men and women decided to become pirates?
It's a great question that I'm asked all the time, but it's a trick question. What I like to do is distinguish between piracy as an act performed versus a pirate as a person, an individual person. And I think it is actually much more fruitful to discuss piracy as a form of behavior, as an act, rather than a pirate, because in fact, in reality, it tends to be an individual who commits an act of piracy as part of a much more broad and varied career. very few people in human history have actually self-identified as being a pirate. There's some, I'm sure Blackbeard at one point said, okay, fine, I'm a pirate. But generally speaking, most people thought of themselves as something else. And they actually did have fairly broad careers. And one way of imagining this is thinking of a young boy who steals candy. And he gets caught by his parents and he's punished and he's embarrassed and he never does it again. And he goes on to get a PhD in history and becomes a historian. And all of a sudden you see that person on the street, you wouldn't point at them and go, there is a thief. That's what a thief looks like. That's how a thief dresses. That would be sort of ridiculous. And it makes more sense to say, okay, there's a person who committed an act of crime, who stole something at one point, but you can't define them as being that thing. And in fact, in reality, and we see this in my book, I think you see this quite a bit, is that you see a handful of individuals who see themselves as sort of legendary pirates and can imagine a legitimate commerce as a way of life, Blackbeard being one of them. On the other hand, you have someone like Sir Francis Drake, whose circumnavigation around the world made him globally famous, but he would be considered really not a pirate by the vast majority of people, particularly in England, certainly not in Spain. So I think most activities are somewhere in this middle of this spectrum. And I think that's one of the things that I really worked with quite a bit, was talking about that spectrum within the book itself. And the spectrum itself became one of the themes of the book, is where someone fit within this sort of murky world of legitimate to illegitimate maritime warfare. Again, most men committed piracy, let's say, at one point, and then they went on to become fishermen or trade as merchants. Some might have joined the Royal Navy. That actually happened quite a bit. If you might have been just a legitimate merchant trader who had an opportunity to, let's say, attack a traditional enemy, let's say the Spanish happened to be in your purview, you might attack that ship, take the goods from that ship, and then move on, hoping that no one will ever notice. So most were adventurers who committed acts of piracy from one time or another. In fact, most people who committed acts of piracy in the 17th and 18th century, particularly in the 17th century, it actually changes a little bit in the 18th century, but in the 17th century, most people wanted to strike it rich once and settle down and buy land. And it's boring to most people. I understand that. You want Johnny Depp, but most of the pirates who do well, and they want to enjoy their wealth. They want to be part of the upper echelon of colonial society. They want to buy land, marry local women, right? They wanted to actually enjoy their wealth. Being a pirate is very dangerous. It's not a lot of fun. In fact, being at sea in general is not necessarily a lot of fun in the 17th century. People die often, the food's terrible. And so, the idea of defining what a pirate looks like, sounds like, even what a pirate talks like, International Talk Like a Pirate Day, which is on September 19th every year. And I sort of laugh at that day because I always imagine someone being a common sailor one day and he's just speaking like the rest of us, and all of a sudden he joins a pirate crew and he has to change the entire way he talks. It doesn't really make any sense. So I say, yes, sailors talk differently than other people, but pirates are not necessarily speaking any differently than a typical sailor. So in that sense, it's a bit of a loaded question. And I always tell people I prefer to think of just sort of sailors in a broad maritime world, living and acting in this sort of complicated, murky world of maritime law, and not necessarily committing themselves to a world of strictly piracy.
Geez, Mark, I think you're killing our dream here of what pirates look like and who they were. I mean, where are the tricorn hats, peg legs, eye patches, and talking parrots? You make it really seem like pirates were just everyday people.
No, not necessarily. I don't want to ruin all your myths, because there are truths to almost all the myths to an extent. Pirates did have parrots as pets, like many sailors did. If food became a problem, that parrot was gone immediately. The idea that a pirate would dress flamboyantly actually has some truth to it. So let's say you're a captain on a pirate ship and you're of low status, like most people who maybe went to commit piracy were of low status. And captains on Royal Navy ships, and typically on a merchant marine ship, would have been of a higher status. The natural inclination would be to understand and obey that leader, because they're of a higher political and social status than you are. On a pirate ship, if the captain is of equal status to the rest of the crew, it can really cause a problem if you want people to obey your orders and actually follow the hierarchical system that makes a ship actually function efficiently. So what defines people visibly in social status? And in the 17th, 18th century, it's clothing. Clothing makes the person. And so if you could take the frilly silk coat and the nice hat and look like you're part of the gentry, potential, upper echelons of society, you would steal that immediately if you were a captain and put it on, because you want your crew to look at you and say, here's a person of higher status. So there is actually a lot of truth to that. The stealing of clothing, in fact, one of the great sources of plunder is the East Indies, what is today the Indian Ocean. And a lot of the goods that they were stealing were silk and calico, and they were using that to, sell in the colonies, but also wear some of that flamboyant clothing. So not all of it is wrong, but I will stick with the talk like a pirate. That's the one thing I will ruin for you.
Let's continue to reshape what we know about pirates. Tell us about how pirate ships operated. How did pirates identify ships that they wanted to attack because they thought those ships carried cargo they might want to have?
One thing to keep in mind as far as piracy as a whole, I think one of the things that my students mention quite often is that the ocean is so incredibly vast. How is it possible that an individual pirate could find another ship on this amazingly vast ocean? And there's actually a bit of a problem with that notion, which is the way the oceanic currents move, the way the Gulf Stream moves, the way islands create bottlenecks that require ships to go through very tight and narrow spaces like the Straits of Florida or the Straits of Malacca near what is today Indonesia, or let's say the small, narrow space it takes to get from the Indian Ocean into the Red Sea. These are very narrow spots that extremely rich shipping sails through. So that's one thing, that the locations of where valuable shipping goes are actually much more limited than we can imagine. So it's actually much easier. So one would be find those bottlenecks, find those locations where the shipping really has to go. You go to places where you know there's going to be things that are extremely valuable. So let's say silver from New Spain, that's going to be the large fleet sailing out of the various entrepot ports of New Spain that are going to have to go through the Straits of Florida. Luxury items that are really difficult to obtain from the Indian Ocean, like silk, calico, and gold. In the 1690s, shipping from the Mughal Empire, which is a Muslim empire in India, most of India at the time, they often would send ships to go on pilgrimage to Jeddah and Mecca. And those would be extremely wealthy ships because they were going to provide presents and other gifts. And so English pirates based in the American colonies sailed off into the Indian Ocean, based themselves in Madagascar, and focused on those sort of bottleneck areas to attack the Mughal Empire. Now, other goods that were extremely valuable in the 17th century would be slaves, which were very difficult to obtain in sort of the northern colonies in particular. So many pirates sort of based themselves off the coast of Africa. And not just slaves, there's also ivory, or what they called elephant's teeth at the time, as well as gold off of Africa. And then another location that they would find would also be places that were valuable but weakly fortified. And that would be in the 1680s in particular, what they called the South Sea, which is the coastline of what is today Chile and Peru, which the Spanish had not really put significant amount of fortification and financial investment in taking care of those towns. And so if you could cross over the Isthmus of Panama or sail around the Straits of Magellan, you could do pretty well attacking shipping and towns along that coastline. And so those are other areas that were, extremely key places to actually plunder.
Would you tell us more about pirates and slaves? You mentioned that pirates found slaves to be valuable goods, and yet I think it may be hard for us to think about human cargo as pirate booty.
My book talks a lot about slavery. It's pretty essential in part because there's an interesting phenomenon that you see with piracy. And one is pirates appear in locations and are welcomed in places where slaves are heavily desired, because early on in the 17th century, pirates are plundering the Portuguese or Spanish and stealing the slaves on board and then reselling them to the various colonies, particularly in the Caribbean in the early years. So slaves are commodities in the 17th century, and the first slaves to arrive in what is today North America and Jamestown as well as Bermuda were brought by pirates. And that is a trend that continued into the 17th century. What's interesting about slavery, that you see an interesting pattern. In the early years, Jamaica might be the best example. Jamaica was conquered by the English in 1655. That early on, the monopoly companies that control the slave trade are not adequately supplying slaves to these colonies. And so pirates are stealing them and selling them in the colony of Jamaica. This is true of Bermuda, it's true of Jamestown and other places. What's interesting, there's an interesting pattern when slaves become a majority in a location. You start seeing local politicians less excited about supporting sea marauders. And the reason being, it means a lack of sort of social stability, a fear of rebellion, a fear of Spanish attack that would actually lead to or inspire rebellion in these places that pirates would only contribute to. So let's say you have a number of individual white men who are not able to obtain plantations of their own with slaves and are maybe unhappy about being in Jamaica, working as clerks or feeling like themselves as servants, that you have this population of unruly white men. A pirate shows up in Jamaica. A, they would probably prefer to jump off and join that pirate crew, and B, that it means that fewer population that's there to sort of protect from slave revolt. So there's an interesting correlation between supporting piracy and not supporting piracy based on the populations of slaves in particular colonies. So I see this in Virginia, certainly in Barbados. Barbados is rarely ever supportive of piracy at all, and that's because they had a high slave population very early. That's other reasons behind it too, having to do with currents and shipping and that kind of thing. But one of the reasons has to do with this high population of pirates at the time.
I want us to explore island and colonial support for pirates so we can better understand how pirates operated between the late 16th and early 18th centuries. But before we explore that topic, please tell us that when pirates went to these oceanic bottlenecks and waited for ships carrying expensive luxury goods, that there were big ship battles with cannons like we see in the movies.
First, they're not called cannons. This is one of these maritime nitpicky things. Once you take a cannon, you put it on a boat, it's a gun. So they would call them guns. So it would be a 10-gun vessel. So there were gunfights. Yes, absolutely. However, I will say that the most valuable thing typically for a pirate to steal is a ship. So your best goal as a pirate is to not destroy the ship as best you can. You want to take the ship, so you would fire into the sails. You would do whatever it takes to sort of just keep that ship from being able to maneuver, to be able to escape, to be able to sort of get away from you. You don't want to destroy the ship. So that's one of the tricky businesses of being a pirate, is how to attack, take a vessel, and not lose the ship. I'll give you just a quick example of this. He's Blackbeard. And Blackbeard is a very famous image of him taken from a later edition of the General History of the Pirates, where he would have his beard and he would roll it up into these sort of little tails, like Rastafarian. Then he would put ribbons on the ends of these tails. And at the end, he would put some sort of smoking matchstick so that his face was engulfed in smoke. And people have always said that's completely crazy. He must have been some sort of maniac, when in fact it's not. If you have a over 6 foot tall man with his face engulfed in smoke with this large beard, you're not going to fight. You will do your best to sort of, give up the ship as fast as you can. And so there's something very successful and brilliant about doing that, which is, I don't want to fight you. So if I look like I'm a demon, you'll just hand over your ship. If I look vulnerable, then we'll fight, and then I might end up destroying the ship that I actually want to take. So there are gun battles, but I would sort of warn you that the best possible fantasy for any pirate is to not have one.
You've really put a lot of wrinkles into our romantic views of pirates, Mark.
Sorry about that.
Let's move on to shore. Earlier you mentioned that colonial governments and gentry supported pirates and piracy. Did this support for pirates create the pirate nests you note in your book title? Would you tell us what pirate nests were?
A pirate nest, I use it in the title of the book. It's a bit of a trick because it's not a term anyone would have called their own community at all, certainly. It's a pejorative term used by royal officials. And typically it meant communities that actively sought out sea marauding as a way of bolstering their economy, and who did not sort of envision themselves as seeing this as any particular problem. And so it's a term used quite often originally to describe places like Algiers in North Africa and other communities like that. But they're places that really relied heavily on supporting pirates. But it's a term that was used by royal officials, and I think make it clear that this goes back to the discussion about language, which is that there really is a disjunct between royal officials and sort of colonial officials over who's a pirate, who's not a pirate, and often has to do with the words they use. So that's one of the sort of, again, tricks of discussing this topic. One of the successes of the book is to explain why someone would do something that we on the service imagine as being illicit or criminal, which is supporting someone that they know has committed an act according to international law as being illegal, attacking someone who is technically an ally, right? And so one of the things I try to do is not have one simple explanation, which is, I think, what historians do better than most other disciplines, is that we pull together variables and show their interconnectedness. So one person might say it has to do with economics. There are books written in the past about simply this is an economic motivation. And that explanation would say, okay, there's grand monopolies that control the movement of heavily desired goods throughout the world and the empire. One would be bullion from New Spain, which would mean a local currency, local medium of exchange, silver and gold, that's controlled by the monopolies of Spain itself. The other would be slaves that we talked about before, controlled by the large monopoly companies, which means people in Virginia, for example, in the early 17th century struggled to obtain slaves. Or luxury goods like silk, calico, or Arabian gold coming from the Indian Ocean. That's controlled by the East India Company, a very much hated monopoly, hated by colonies. So these goods were brought, and they were not only brought, they were cheap for obvious reasons. Always cheaper when you bring something in without having to pay customs or shipping costs. So that's one. It would be simply economics. And that is true. I think many of these communities felt justified economically because they felt like these monopolies were nothing that they had themselves supported. They were very much against these monopolies and felt bitter about many of the economic policies fostered in London that they felt harmed local communities in the colonies. The other would be law, and I've talked about this before. The law surrounding piracy and privateering was fluid, complicated, undetermined in many locations, described differently in one colony versus another colony. Another, which is, I think, something more nuanced and hard for me to describe briefly because it's such a complicated part of the book, and a really important part of the book had to do with politics, which is that there became a real divide between royal officials who wanted one particular type of government and royal authority versus local officials who wanted to be more independent and have their own say about the sort of political and social system that they wanted to create in the colonies. And so there became a real rift between royal officials who wanted to call everyone a pirate and local officials who wanted to sort of say, no, these are legitimate, sea marauders who they're only attacking infidels and we think we should support them. And the best example of that would be Quakers in Philadelphia. And they were active supporters of pirates. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but one of them being really political, which is that they felt that the attempts to sort of rout out piracy piracy had nothing to do with piracy at all. It was really a ruse to create a royal government that was going to take away their religious rights and toleration. They were going to implement Anglican churches, and they were going to sort of infiltrate sort of Quaker political system. And so they were actively bringing pirates free or supporting them or welcoming their homes or marrying local Quaker women because Quakers just didn't see what they were doing as being criminal, and the other just being more aggressive against, royal authority. So politics became something really subtle and yet significant. And another would be, let's say, popular culture. During the 17th century, there was an active popular culture, whether it was ballads or just sort of stories that would be spread throughout the empire that saw a lot of this kind of behavior, this sort of illicit sea marauding, this sort of going out on your own as being something, heroic or at least defensible. One of the most important books in the history of pirates is Alexander Esquemeling's Buccaneers of America that was translated into English and printed in 1684. And the preface to that book by the English translator talks about people who would be considered pirates by the Spanish, by most people considered pirates. And he says, these are these amazing, heroic, unparalleled individuals who we should emulate. This is how empires are built. These are people who we would define as pirates. But even this writer of this preface is saying these are these remarkable Englishmen that we should extol and praise. And so here's a culture that's giving you mixed signals. It's telling you that you might die, you might be executed for this, yet a publisher is saying this is how empires are built. And so these are all variables that I tried to blend together and explain how they're interconnected and how they work together to create a world, a sort of type of society or culture that did not at all imagine these people as being criminals. And that's what I meant by going back to repeating the idea that I don't see corruption as the root of all this. If all these variables come together to define these people as heroic supporters of local economies who, according to our local legal system, are not criminals at all, and are in fact heroic, and this is how empires are built, this is not necessarily corruption if you really believe it. If you really truly believe it, then from our perspective, when you start calling them corrupt, then you're really being ahistorical. You're using your own perspective and not trying to understand the people from the past.
Cash-strapped economies, expensive monopoly company goods. It kind of sounds like the colonists viewed pirates like Robin Hood types. They brought goods that the colonists needed and wanted into the colonies and sold them at cheap prices. I mean, no wonder colonists supported pirates. Who doesn't support Robin Hood?
Funny if you bring that up. Robin Hood had a history to the story. The whole stealing from the rich and giving to the poor is actually smack dab in the period when pirates are being supported in the colonies around the 1680s and 1690s. And there's a pirate named John Avery who wrote a ballad that actually hinted at and actually seemed to mirror a lot of the Robin Hood ballads that had come just a few years before. So there is something interesting about whether there's something about that culture, that sort of rise of that new type of Robin Hood, the aristocratic Robin Hood who had lost his sort of patrimony and now was preying upon the rich. That there is something interesting that story had sort of popped up around the same time that these other stories are popping up about pirates being heroic and supporting local economies. The other thing about Robin Hood that you touch on, and I don't talk about Robin Hood a lot in the book, but it's great that you brought it up because Robin Hood is not disloyal. Robin Hood is very loyal. Robin Hood is very supportive of his king. He just hates the sheriff of Nottingham, right, who is a corrupt local official trying to illegally implement authority over the local customs of the local people, right? So Robin Hood is this guy coming in and saying, I'm helping the local people. I still love my country. I still love my country. In fact, I love my country so much, I think this sheriff of Nottingham is the one who's challenging the great notions of what my country brings to bear. And so I see this with pirates. I see the locals are supporting pirates not because they don't support the king. They love the king. They can't stand these royal officials who seem selfish and looking for their own sort of financial wellspring that they can't seem to obtain.
So, if pirates were loyal to the landed communities they supported, how did landed communities demonstrate their loyalty to pirates?
Twofold. One is they were very much involved in sending them out, particularly in the 1690s. War arises in 1688 after the Glorious Revolution against the French. And local colonies, governors and colonies, decided they were going to wage this war against the French by providing commissions to privateers, but they left the commissions really open, essentially saying, attack the enemies of England. And so they would fit out ships. They would gather crews. Crews would be very happy to sign up because they had a piece of paper signed by a governor that seemed pretty legit, Lawful Authority. And they would obtain the ships. They would actually, sell them sails and barrels and other things that were necessary. So they would fit those ships out and they would go into the Indian Ocean saying, okay, well, the general, enemies of England might be Muslim people because, this is quote unquote the infidel. And maybe that seems justified. And the governors clearly didn't care. So on the one hand, local communities fitted out these ships. They also actively supported them, let's say in Madagascar. There were New York merchants living in Madagascar. They would send alcohol, food, and other goods to Madagascar, and they would sort of outfit those ships from Madagascar to attack Muslim pilgrimage vessels. And then when they return, typically when a ship, let's say coming from the Indian Ocean, would return, they would start following the Gulf Stream. They would start in the south and sail along the eastern seaboard, dropping individual crews off, rather than one crew, sort of 30 guys showing up in Charleston, South Carolina. I mean, maybe 4 would stop off, and then another 4 in Philadelphia, another 4 in Boston. And probably, if they were smart, they would go to a governor who they knew was supportive of them and say, hey, I came from a successful voyage. Don't ask me a lot of questions. Your wife, I've got her some silk and calico. This is a gift to you. The governor would say, wow, this is great. And they would quickly look around, find local women, marry them, use all their booty to buy land, and become farmers. This happened a lot. And this goes back to the theme that I talked about before, the idea that few people want to be pirates for the rest of their lives. And so a lot of them married local women and settled down. And so communities supported them by A, selling them goods they needed, B, selling them land, and then C, when royal officials start finding out about this and start causing havoc and trying to raise posses and hunt these pirates down, locals protected them. On the one hand, they would allow these people in their homes. They would hide them purposefully. If royal officials did throw them in prison, and this actually, the entire book starts off with an incident like this, where a royal official was able to get a pirate in prison, locals sprung them free. They just physically tore the jail down. There's one story of a man named Moses Butterworth, who was thrown in a prison in New Jersey. And in the middle of the night, a riot arose, primarily Quakers, who tore the prison down and threatened the sheriff and the judge and sprung Moses Butterworth free. And Moses had no idea what was going on. He didn't really know any of these people. But in reality, they were really angry about the political system that was being imposed upon them by outsiders. And they saw Moses Butterworth as a symbol of that kind of thing. And they wanted to spring him free just to make a point that locals are the ones who determine law, not these outsiders. And so they not only supported them just financially, they supported them physically, physical support of removing them from jails. So this is overt. This isn't just an intellectual support. This isn't like we just, turn a blind eye. This often was overt and active support.
As we know, this colonial support didn't last forever. After all, communities like Boston and New York no longer support pirates or piracy. Mark, would you take us through this change in sentiment? Would you tell us about the War on Pirates, which took place between 1716 and 1726?
First, the book is in many ways 2 halves. In fact, at one point I thought about dividing the book into volume 1 and volume 2, and it reads a little bit like that. The first 5 chapters are chronological, and they describe this active support in different time periods and in different locations around the globe. And then it just transforms really dramatically in the year 1696. And that year is important for a lot of reasons, but I'll give you one example, which is that in England, in London, they knew colonies were supporting pirates, but they had no idea the extent of it. And a number of what they call Red Sea pirates, guys who had been preying in the Indian Ocean, were captured, and they were tried in London. And during this trial, a number of witness accounts, including from the pirates themselves, displayed the sheer volume and openness of support in the colonies by governors, in fact, some royal governors. And this really shook people up. And Board of Trade had been created, not necessarily just for pirates, but a Board of Trade based on information gathering and other purposes. And all of a sudden, they did investigations. And over the course of roughly the next 20 years, and this is where the book slows down and looks really narrowly and tightly at many specific individual stories, is where it's really a massive contest between local people trying to protect these people and royal officials trying to stop it. And there are riots that happen. There's pirates moving from colony to colony. There's important governors are almost arrested for this support. So it's a very heavily and heatedly contested issue for 20 years. But eventually, the colonies, for all those reasons I described before, economic, legal, political, start to change their view on piracy. And I can't go into all the reasons for that, but I'll give you one example. Almost each of those monopolies that I talked about before gets challenged by the 1690s and the early 18th century. And so all of a sudden, by the Treaty of Utrecht, 1713, slaves, for example, you can obtain from interlopers as opposed to the Royal African Company monopoly. There's a competing East India Company. In fact, East India Company luxury goods were banned for a number of reasons from England, so all of a sudden they're being resold in the colonies for much cheaper prices. In fact, even though during it there's a war against Spain at one point, the Crown allows the colonists to trade legally with New Spain, where they can obtain bullion at much easier rates. So all of a sudden, for economic reasons, political reasons, legal reasons, the colonies really transform their understanding of their relationship to piracy. And they begin to say, okay, all the legal reasons why we had supported them are no longer in existence. In fact, pirates are now a nuisance. We can obtain all the things we need to obtain. There's no reason to support these people committing acts of violence that are no longer seen as legitimate. So what ends up happening by 1713 is the end of the War of Spanish Succession, so 1713, the Treaty of Utrecht, and you have a number of individual sailors who had once been fighting the Royal Navy were now sort of on their own, unemployed. Many of them became fishermen, others became part of the merchant marine, but others thought, hey, we've been committing acts of seaborne violence for years, let's keep doing it, not quite realizing that the atmosphere had changed. So many of them sailed to the Bahamas and start to sort of figure out what to do with themselves, and they begin to prey on English shipping. And this introduces the period, how we started this conversation about how you imagine pirates looking like and sounding like. It's typically from this period, which is very short, roughly 1715 to 1725. That's the vast majority of all of us picturing pirates when we watch movies. That's what we imagine. It's a very small period. And it's called a war on pirates because pirates are not being actively supported anymore. And they're really forced to either stay stay at sea attacking other English vessels, really a phenomenon that hadn't really been occurring before, and not having a place to go and being at defiance with local communities. They go to the Bahamas, but there's really not much in the Bahamas. I mean, today there's resorts and it's fantastic to go on vacation, but in the 17th century, 18th century, it's not a fantastic location. But it's not self-sustaining, meaning that it's very difficult during the War of Pirates period to maintain crews. Because in the 1680s and 1690s, you could tell a young farm boy who's 18, hey, you can sail with a commission signed by the governor into the Indian Ocean, plunder the infidels, who we all know are okay to plunder. You can make huge amounts of money from emeralds and diamonds and calico and silk, return by land and be a hero. That sounds great. That sounds fantastic. In 1718, 1722, you go to a fisherman off the coast of Cape Cod and you capture him and put him on your ship and you say, okay, join our crew. And that 18-year-old says, okay, well, what's in it for me? So, well, we're going to float around and we're going to attack Englishmen. He said, wait, you're going to attack our own people? Before we didn't attack our own people. And I said, well, yeah, that's the idea. And I said, okay, well, what are you going to take? Well, we're going to take gold and silver. And he said, well, wait a minute, what's gold and silver worth if we're just going to be floating around the whole time? It's only worth its exchange value, right? If we have no pirate nests to go to anymore, what's the point of silver and gold? And I said, okay, well, that makes sense. There's no real point to that. So we'll steal alcohol. That sounds good. So we'll be drunk the whole time. And that's better than, I guess, the alternative. So the idea that you would tell an 18-year-old that you're going to float around, never see your family again, steal silver and gold that you can never spend, and likely die within 6 months, which is probably the average lifespan of someone in a pirate during that time period. So you can imagine it's not a great sell. It explains why that period, this golden age of pirates, this sort of war on pirates period, just fizzles out by the 1720s because there's just no way of convincing people to join these crews for really no purpose.
We've had a really wide-ranging conversation today. We've covered the rise and fall of piracy and dispelled a lot of myths about pirates. But before we move into the time warp, we need to know about one more aspect of piracy. How does understanding how piracy developed and took place in the late 16th, 17th, and early to mid-18th centuries help us understand our present-day world?
You know, I think one of the things historians do as scholars, better really than most disciplines, we take a wide variety of seemingly disparate and seemingly unrelated variables. Let's say religious beliefs versus interest rates, right? Things that don't seem to show up in the same box or category. And we try to interconnect them and show how they're related to each other, and that no single variable can explain a fascinating or complicated phenomenon. So if we look at something like supporting piracy, it's a dramatic thing. It's a big decision for any society to make to do this, and to understand why they would do something that seemingly is so radical or potentially criminal requires a really understanding of multiple variables and how they relate to each other. And so if you think about all the interrelated ideas of law, politics, economics, popular culture, even religion, and what that teaches about 17th century support of what is nominally, meaning according to international law, a crime, I think if we can see all those variables interrelating with each other, we can actually do that with modern problems. You know, one of the things we talk about Somali piracy is you often see political scientists saying this has to do with local political regimes. This has to do with the breakdown of Puntland versus Somaliland and those political distinctions. And that's one reason why it's piracy. In economics, economically, they would come in and say, well, this has to do with market forces. This has to do with a third world country unable to obtain first world goods coming out of the Red Sea and performing these acts for economic reasons. Although those people will be wrong, might say it has to do with religion and, sort of Islam against the rest of the world, which we know is actually not true at all in Somalia. But I think what historians do, and I hope my work does, is sort of compel you to say, let's look at all these things as a whole and see what kind of culture is produced in the end that makes people perform these acts, not just some simple variable. And in fact, one way of doing this, one lesson I hope people learn, for example, is let's say someone who is a Nigerian youth who is on a boat with his colleagues attacks a ship that's serving an oil rigger, and they call themselves the Nigerian Revolutionary Liberation Army. We might laugh at that and say these are a bunch of thugs and criminals, but in fact, there might be a culture where they perceive themselves as somehow fighting a known or typical enemy. They see themselves justified on some sort of legal purposes. So I think it forces us to think in much more nuanced and complex ways than I think often we do about these particular topics. And I think what it really does more than anything else is it compels us to be much more empathetic, not sympathetic, meaning I don't sympathize with pirates. I don't feel bad for them. I don't try to justify any of their behavior, really. I'm just trying to grasp what is it like for, let's say, a merchant in Newport, Rhode Island in the 1690s to welcome and support someone I know who committed an act of violence in the Red Sea against the Mughal emperor. What is their mindset? What makes them feel that it's okay to do this? What helps them go to bed at night? And if I can empathize with that, if I can grasp the complexity of that person's mindset, then I think I can do that today. I can do that when I'm trying to understand people who are politically different than me, who vote differently than me. I can understand their childhood, what kind of education they have, the kind of culture they've been raised in. And so I think what historians do more than anything else is we teach a radical form of empathy, a radical way of understanding people as different as possible from the sort of society that we were raised in. And I think that's hopefully the goal of almost every historian, is to actually provide and teach and foster empathy in our readers and our students.
Let's move into the time warp. This is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently.
The Time Warp. Historians can't predict the future, but they can speculate about what might have been.
In your opinion, what might have happened if piracy and pirates had not existed during the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries? How would the absence of pirates have affected the development of English, later British, America?
I would say this. If we go back to politics as being essential as it was, to the reasons why communities supported pirates, I think that supporting them expressed a sense of rebellion and protest against the way London administrators had been treating or taking care of these communities. It expressed a lack of information or knowledge about life in the colonies from colonial administrators. It showed that their support of monopolies, these monopolies had been very one-sided and not seen the integration of the empire as a whole. They didn't really understand or grasp the struggles that were going on in the colonies. So I think the presence of pirates, really more than anything, it helped sort of shake up administrators in London in good ways, I think, for the colonies in the end, to say, hey, maybe privateering is being constrained in ways that are not helping the defense of the colonies, or maybe these monopolies are making it difficult to obtain goods in these colonies. Maybe we should open up trade. Maybe we should actually have a better understanding and communication with colonial leaders. I think because of that, if you hadn't had pirates, perhaps these colonies would have remained significantly more independent, would have had just sort of quietly remained doing whatever they wanted to do on their own without London having any idea. And in the end, there might have been a far less integrated, formally integrated empire that really we see as a thing that's much more coherent by the War of Jenkins' Ear, which is the late 1630s. And that coherent empire is something that gave rise to the success of the 7 Years' War, which is the greatest sort of single grasp of land that expanded the British Empire in remarkable and unforeseeable ways by 1763, and the need to pay for that massive empire, creating duties, stamp acts, and other things that led to the American Revolution, which is the end result in the splitting up of the empire and the creation of the United States. That, if I'm going to push this as far as I possibly can, which seems like you want me to do, we can make that case that all these massive movements in the end might not have had the same ripple effects through history over time.
Did writing Pirate Nests hook you on pirates, Mark? Or are you going back to family history for your next project?
I'm stuck on pirates. It's so fascinating. It's so complicated. It highlights so many huge global problems and issues of international law, issues of right and wrong, issues of humanitarian debates that sort of span national stories, that span really even chronological stories. So I'm sticking with piracy because it really illuminates such grander historical issues. And so my second book still isn't dealing with piracy, and it's much more about sort of how piracy relates to grander issues of the abolition of the slave trade, or how do we understand revolutions, for example, when do revolutionaries become patriots rather than pirates? How does empire building and expansion, how is that piracy or not piracy? I'm continuing in these really big issues and stories, and how the use of understanding piracy helps us sort of understand the nuances of some of these grander humanitarian debates going into the 19th century. So it's interesting how I stayed still writing about pirates and still teaching about pirates as someone who wasn't born and raised a pirate fan, yet nonetheless I've become a fan in an intellectual sense.
Where is the best place to look for more information about you and how we can contact you if we still have questions about pirates?
You can find me on my department website, which is History Department of University of California, San Diego. You can see me on my website there, and you can contact me through my website. And also my email is HANNA@ucsd.edu. And you can also see my book on the UNC Press website.
Mark Hanna, thank you for providing us with a fascinating look into both mythical and factual pirates.
Well, thank you. I really enjoyed talking with you about this.
Historians look at a lot of different variables to try to make sense of the past so we can better understand the present. Mark certainly looked at a lot of different variables to try and figure out why men and women became pirates and why so many colonial communities supported their often illicit work. As we heard, the variables Mark investigated reveal a multifaceted picture of who worked and served as pirates. Men and women turned to piracy for economic opportunity, to rebel against government authority, to protect their communities because the English Navy couldn't, and for a whole myriad of other reasons. This knowledge certainly complicates our picture of pirates as rum-drinking men on a constant hunt for buried treasure. And it's important we complicate our knowledge of pirates, because as Mark noted, understanding pirates and piracy helps us better understand how early American communities and governments operated and developed. Plus, developing a better understanding of why pirates became pirates and why colonial communities supported their work also helps us improve our ability to empathize. Empathizing with pirates doesn't mean we have to sympathize with them or the acts they committed. It just means that we have to try and look at the big picture of why these men and women of the high seas captured ships, stole cargo, and then looked to landed communities for support. It's by looking at as many of these variables as possible for how and why people of the past acted as they did that we'll better understand not only our early American past, but our present-day world too. For more information about Mark, his book, Pirate Nests and the Rise of the British Empire, plus everything we talked about today, check out the show notes page, benfranklinsworld.com/099. Next week is episode 100. I'm still kind of in shock about this. To ensure you don't miss this special episode, be sure to subscribe to the show. You can subscribe to Ben Franklin's World in all the major podcast apps, some smaller ones too, or you can download the free Ben Franklin's World app from your favorite app store. Finally, Mark thinks we can understand a lot of what went on in early America and why it happened if we take the time to study pirates. What do you think? Send your answers to Liz at benfranklinsworld.com, tweet them to me at Liz Covart, or post a comment on the show notes page or in our listener community on Facebook.
And remember, never leave till tomorrow that which you can do today.